So I thought it would be fun to walk through my process for painting a portrait in both digital in Procreate and traditional using acrylics. And the drawing is done on illustration board. Now I've taken the drawing from the illustration board, I have scanned it, and I brought it into Procreate. So I'm working from the same drawing, the same traditional pencil drawing. I'm going to be painting this portrait of Spock here from Star Trek, the original series. And I've created a previous video. It's available to Patreon members that walks through the process that I use to capture an accurate likeness like this in a drawing to get all the features and proportions of the face in correctly. Now, a lot of times the first thing I do in a drawing like this is I just want to create a bit more tone and a bit more texture, and I will often do that with a layer of just like paint flecks, just like little bitty, tiny little dots that I usually will flick with a like bristly stencil brush on the traditional side. And on the digital side in Procreate, I will use like a brush from my sketch kit that is just something that just like tiny flecks, something that just will throw all these little bitty tiny splatters and create some additional tone and texture in the painting. Adding in this base layer of tiny little paint specks is a technique I picked up from Drew Struzan, who was a master poster artist that worked a lot during the 70s and 80s on movie posters. Now, from here, I want to add just some overall, just like a color wash that's going to just kind of tone everything, because right now the background is not white, it's just a light gray color. But if I add a texture over that, it's just going to tone everything slightly brownish red. Now for the traditional side, I'm going to go a little bit more intense, and I'm going to mix together some just warm colors like burnt sienna, Van Dyke red, maybe some oranges, just to create a wash that's going to go over the entire face here, that's just going to give everything an even tone. Okay, now that we have some nice texture in place, we've got some toning going on, some middle tones. Now I want to begin to add in some base color or some local color. And I want to do that with a very soft airbrush. And the key to doing this very, very transparent, soft color is just to take the opacity of the airbrush and take it down to like 10% so that it stays just, again, very transparent. Now with the traditional side, I'm going to take an actual airbrush, I'm going to water down the acrylic, and I'm going to spray it in very to create these very soft color transitions for my base colors. Now, you don't have to use an airbrush for the traditional painting. You could also just water down the acrylics and create some nice washes. Now, I'm going to use colors like yellow ochre, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue for this step. Now, I'm going to try to match those colors as best I can in Procreate, and a lot of times I will do a layer of airbrush below the sketch, and then I'm going to do another one above the sketch so that I'm starting to blend some of those sketch line colors in with my base colors. Okay, so now that I've got some color in, the next thing I want to do is add in some darks, like the darkest darks, so that I can begin layering in values. Now, I typically add the darkest darks before I start to bring in the highlights, because it helps me to understand the highlights better when the darks are already in place. So I'll use a combination of the airbrush again, with the very soft, low opacity airbrush, and I will also use maybe an acrylic brush or something with a harder edge, again to lay in some of these darks, but to keep it very transparent so that you can still see some of my pencil lines here. Now, in the traditional side, I want to keep my blacks very transparent, very watered down, so that they stay somewhat transparent and that I can kind of build them up. And I'll use a flat brush so I can have hard, detailed edges. Now, a good tip for working traditionally, which I usually don't follow, is to keep your hands clean because stuff like this can happen. But oh well, what do you do? But just keep painting. Now, here's where the digital and traditional process will deviate a little bit before coming back together. So, on the digital side, I'm going to just add in a few highlights with a really bright, sort of yellowish white pencil. And I'm just basically marking where all of the brightest highlights are in the portrait. Now, on the traditional side, I've gone ahead and watered down some white acrylic gesso, and I am subtly bringing in or bringing up the highlights with this very, very transparent gesso. Now, it's probably a 70-30 or maybe 80-20 mixture, with it being mostly water. It's just very, very transparent, and I'm subtly bringing back the highlights. Now, once these highlights have dried, I'm going to take some very bright, like neon pink and orange, these just really, really bright colors. And I'm going to water these down into a wash and I'm going to paint them over the entire portrait. Now, this is kind of like adding like an overlay layer blend mode in Procreate because I'm just gonna allow these really bright colors to kind of come through before I start to overlap more highlights on top of that wash. Okay, back in Procreate, I am going to go ahead and I'm going to paint the background a lighter, not quite white, but almost white, just to blend our textures and give it sort of a painterly look. So I'm going to add that layer in, which is just a large acrylic brush. It's also giving me some of these more like painterly looking edges, some stuff like this right here, this, and it's gonna give it more, or it's just this overall like textured painterly feel. I'm also going to add in some of this like orangish red wash and a purplish pink wash to just kind of match that look that I had going in the traditional piece. And speaking of traditional piece, it's time to do the same thing with the background. I'm going to take some acrylic gesso again, not quite as watered down. I'm going to mix in a little bit of raw umber to so that it's not pure white, and I'm going to give the same treatment to the background around the portrait. Now in Procreate, it's time to take a very transparent, like a bright yellowy white sort of brush and bring up the highlights to match what we have on the traditional side. So I'm going to do that with this layer here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on this layer here, which is just more additional highlights. So I also want to go ahead and turn on a couple of textures that I have that are just like noisy textures. Now, a lot of times I will create like you take an illustration board or a canvas panel and just paint lots of like um, gouache textures and just painterly brushstroke textures that I can just bring in and overlay to just add more realism to my paintings. Now with the traditional piece, I'm going to go back to the watered down gouache. It's actually a little bit of yellow ochre and gouache mixed together this time, and I'm going to start to just bring up the highlights even more. Okay, as we're approaching the finish line on both of these paintings, it's now time to take a pencil brush, and I consider this to be a colored pencil because I'm using colors other than black and gray. And it's time to dive in and really start outlining some details and bringing in some additional like highlight colors. And I'm going to do that on this layer here. And I'm going to zoom in so that you can kind of see some of the outlines and some of the additional details that I created here. Stuff like this, like outlining the hair, outlining the eyes, eyebrows, getting in some of those types of details, some additional, little bit of hatching in places like this and this, and just bringing in some of those just really brightly colored or contrasted outlines and some additional colors. Now, on the traditional piece, I'm going to be doing the same thing with actual colored pencils. And again, just doing the same process of just reinforcing outlines and transitions between shapes and things like that to just really bring out the detail. Now, to wrap up both of these paintings, I'm going to add a bit of splatter. And on the digital version, I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to add some directional splatters kind of going off to the left and right. I'm going to create those using some splatter brushes that I have within my master watercolor Procreate brush set. Now, for the traditional side, I'm going to use some bristle brushes, just some brushes that I can maybe tap on my finger and try to get some directional splatters. And I'm going to do this with some watered down acrylic in both orange and blue. So I hope you've enjoyed watching these two paintings come together side by side and that it's given you an idea of how this process can be really, really similar and then also different at times depending on the medium. And I hope it's inspired you to try a process like this of just building up layers of texture and layers of transparent paint. And yeah, let me know what you think down in the comments. Let me know if you've tried something like this or you plan to. And again, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.